So good afternoon. My name is Luis Sala, and I'm Alfresco's Director of Technology Alliances. My primary job function is to work with technology partners and encourage them to integrate into Alfresco in a wide variety of different ways. But I have also like a secret mission, and maybe not so secret, but that is encourage customers, partners, anybody to think about content management in Alfresco, the Alfresco repository, in new, different ways. I'm particularly interested in encouraging you guys to think about content-centric applications that go beyond just document browsing and document access. But we'll certainly start with those basic concepts here. So first and foremost, I encourage you to get a copy of the slides. Hopefully they'll be posted there. In fact, they should be there already. But you can also rate this session. I encourage you to please rate the session. Please be generous. And that's it. So make sure you get that URL. If you're already on your device, I'll give you just a few more seconds. And I will repeat that URL at the end of this session. Also, some basic disclaimers / notes. Basically, in today's conversation, I'm going to, when I mention mobile, I am referring to both smartphones and tablets. So do keep that in mind. I'm just going to use that as a generic umbrella type of a term. And I will be, when I talk about native app development, I'm primarily referring to iOS, and I use a lot of iOS examples, but do keep in mind that the same concepts generally apply to other platforms such as Android, native BlackBerry, and other types of platforms. But yeah, so there will be that bias towards iOS, and I want to make sure that you're aware of that, but that I'm not, and that I'm not specifically focusing on this. On just one platform. So I'll start with a very brief survey. First thing I just want to understand is how many of you are using like an iOS device? Okay, and Android? Okay, very good. Others, BlackBerry or something else? Okay, good. That's all right. There's no shame in that. All right, great. So that just gives me an idea of kind of what the audience, what the audience is like. Yeah, for those of you that are developers, technically oriented, what's your poison in terms of programming languages? Java. Java developers, Java savvy guys, JavaScript. And with JavaScript, I also mean HTML, HTML5, CSS, that kind of stuff, right? And then Objective-C. Has anybody learned Objective-C? 2 people? That's great. That's awesome. You learned Objective-C?
Enough to know I don't like it.
OK, great. Thank you. Anybody else? Any other languages that you work with on a day-to-day basis? PHP. I personally don't think PHP is a language, and I'm sorry to my friends at Acquia, for example, and Dries Buiter in particular, but it isn't. So anyway, so how many of you have developed a mobile app? Okay, 1, 2. If I recall, you used Accelerator, was it?
I've done both Accelerator and extended the old Zia Fresh docs.
Okay, great. So Accelerator and some native development. Okay, anybody else? You said you did some? And what was that? TIFF viewer? A viewer. Okay, great. So, so was it, you did a hybrid and a native. How about you? Same? Hybrid and native?
Actually,
native and HTML5. Great. Okay. Anybody else? No? Okay, that gives me an idea. What kind of concerns do you guys have around mobile app development, particularly, certainly, as it relates to enterprise? But it could be anywhere, any context. For example, I was speaking with the gentleman from Marriott, and they were sharing how security, for example, is a big thing, right? And I'll tell you right now that there's certainly some mobile, some aspects related to security that relate to mobile, and certainly things around mobile device management, being able to, account for and mitigate situations of when the device gets stolen, but also making sure that when it establishes a network connection, it's secure and all these types of things. Also authentication, especially if you're accessing a sensitive backend repository or system. We want to address those types of things. And while I won't necessarily explicitly address these types of matters within this presentation, it's something that if time permits, I will certainly discuss during Q&A. Otherwise, I'll be available just after this session. So let's get started. The first thing I wanted to talk about is just the concept, the idea of Alfresco being a platform for content-centric applications. And I hinted at this in the beginning, that we all are accustomed to using Alfresco primarily for document management. And that's a perfectly great, valid use case. And that's probably going to account for the greater percentage of uses of Alfresco. But we do know that a significant chunk of our customers use Alfresco for powering websites. And so they're using us for HTML, for images, video, and stuff like that. And I would argue that because of the way Alfresco works under the hood, if you strip away, or if you consider that Alfresco is really comprised of two primary elements, those being the user interface, the application, and then the repository or the platform. So the app and the platform, they're two separate things. We start learning and getting the idea that Alfresco can actually be a solid platform for us to develop any kind, virtually any kind of content-centric application. And so Alfresco can be used to manage the life cycle of the content as it gets created, authored, and published, right? And then ultimately its disposition, because ultimately information does become stale and we need to pull it back, or for whatever legal reasons we may need to do certain things with the content, regardless of what type of content it is, whether it's a PDF, a Word doc, an image, or just structured data or something along those lines. And so Alfresco can, in a generic fashion, just be, you can strip away the UI and use, for example, CMS and things like our SDKs to access Alfresco from within your app and do things like create a showroom app for your showcase, or create some other way of browsing through different types of content and slicing and dicing that information in new and creative ways that make it easier to discover. And in fact, I would say that there are three themes that I would focus on when it comes to any kind of app development, but certainly as it relates to mobile. And that is, theme number one would be anything that facilitates discovery, anything that lets you find things easily, anything that lets you capture easily, right? So anything that facilitates the process of capturing information, whether it's taking a picture with your smartphone and then saving into a repository, finding that information, discovery, and then finally sharing, being able to, of course, share information. Because what use is having this database of content if we cannot have other people access that information? So those are kind of the themes. And so CMS, especially in the context of a lot of what we've been doing this last year, is really the backbone on top of which we encourage you to build your applications. And now with these SDKs and APIs and the fact that we have compiled libraries for Java and .NET and a bunch of other languages, really it's a cross-platform solution. And you can start thinking of Alfresco as really a content database of sorts. So I encourage you to learn more. Go to developer.alfresco.com to kind of learn more about our APIs. Another definition, frameworks versus platforms. This is very specific to this presentation, and I just picked those two words to kind of to distinguish some basic concepts here. And when it comes to frameworks, I tend to refer to client-side, things that help you and facilitate client-side app development. So things like the Cocoa framework and Cocoa Touch as it relates to iOS, that would be a framework. It provides usually things like an MVC model or something along those lines to help you structure your application and model out your underlying data model, your controller logic, and your views. But in JavaScript, we have things like Sencha Touch, Accelerator Titanium can be considered somewhat as a framework, although you can use other frameworks on top of it, but that's a little too meta for me at this point in time. PhoneGap, and there are a bunch of other JavaScript frameworks like Ember, Backbone, Sprout Core, and a bunch of others that could be of interest to you. This last set are all HTML5 centric frameworks, and if you want to learn more about HTML5 app development, I will have a session tomorrow, I think at around 2:40 in the afternoon, covering just HTML5. And as I said, they mostly provide MVC. They have helpers to help you deal with user interface elements, things like rendering tables and listing things and swiping and all these kinds of things. So a lot of interaction-related stuff, a lot of networking-related helpers and so forth, things that let you access the camera and other device-specific capabilities. And often the frameworks give you some kind of a build, testing, and packaging tool. So that's my definition of a framework for in the context of this presentation. When it comes to platforms, for me, I'm referring to the back end. So anything that supports the application itself by providing things like data persistence, server-side logic, and that kind of stuff. And examples include, in the consumer world, there's Parse and StackMob among about 6 or 7 different platform as a service types of vendors. And I would argue that Alfresco can be certainly a key component in any kind of a app development platform. Okay? Any questions about this? No? Do feel free to interrupt while I chat, and I will try to answer your question then. If not, we will defer to later in the session. So when it comes to mobile app development, there are basically three paths, and you've probably heard about these. The three main ones are native on one end, HTML5, basically web-based, on the other, and then in the middle you have hybrids. And I would argue that there are two flavors of hybrid types of solutions, and these are usually things, the two of the more popular ways of developing and deploying hybrid apps are through Accelerator Titanium and Apache Cordova, also known as PhoneGap. Okay? And we'll talk about these in a moment. But first, let's start with native. All right, take a deep breath. I'll start with a little parable here. In December 2010, or 2010, yeah, that's in the future. In 2010, I looked like this. So I was a little overweight. And
Your hair was great, too.
yes. And that's my dad, and he unfortunately passed away a few months after that. So that was depressing. It hit me hard. And actually, it relates into the parable as well, because now, as you can see, I've lost a little bit of weight, about 65 pounds, nothing too major, but I feel better, I feel stronger, and I feel better, just generally more positive about myself. But how did I get there? What did it take? Honestly, I had to overcome a certain fear that I had, right? And that fear, was first of all acknowledging that I needed to work on myself and improve certain aspects about myself, but more importantly, I needed to just sit down and basically say, you know what? I just got to do this. I had to take that first step. And that's exactly how I felt about native app development, that I was so afraid of Objective-C and native app development that I just felt like I'm never going to do it. I hate Objective-C. I'm a web developer. I know JavaScript, CSS, etc. That's what I'm going to develop in, and I think that's the right answer for everything. But really, I applied this one lesson that I read in a novel, great fantasy novel, by the way, I highly recommend. But basically, once you've set about a task, once I decided I was going to lose weight, once I decided I was going to learn native app development and Objective-C, it's better to just do it than to live in fear of it. And if there's one thing that I want to encourage you guys to do is that when practical, do consider the native app. Do not be afraid of anything in general, but this is a general life lesson. But certainly when it comes to this particular thing, it is, if you've got a strong programming background, etc., you can learn native app development. It's not hard at all, so I strongly encourage you to do that. I cannot stress this particular idea and concept hard enough. But why would you want to go native then? The primary reasons tend to revolve around performance and user experience. Of course, just writing a native app does not necessarily make for a good experience, but the native frameworks that are provided by iOS and Android go a long way to allowing you to create experiences or user interfaces that are generally smooth, easy to use, reflect information, present information in a consumable fashion. And because they follow the native UI widgets and all the elements and everything else, follow certain conventions that the user is accustomed to, it goes a long way to helping you create a good, solid, productive experience for your users. But you also have to think about design and whatnot, and I'm not going to deal with that particular aspect of things in this conversation. But certainly, performance, native apps are generally faster than any other option you have out there, be it native or hybrid, okay? Excuse me, I'm sorry, HTML5 or hybrid. Generally speaking, if you're targeting only one platform, iOS, for example, or Android, then it might make sense to take that leap into native. And more importantly, though, why do you want native? Full device access. Maybe you need the GPS. Maybe you need, well, you can do GPS in HTML5, but maybe you need the camera. Maybe you need some local file storage or the local database or something along those lines. Those are all perfectly valid reasons why you might want to go native. So, and there are more, right? But those are certainly the top three that came to mind when I thought about the problem. So there are some caveats, though. It's a single platform, right? And if you are targeting multiple devices, then you have to rethink your strategy a little bit. There's a learning curve associated with this. So you're going to need to learn a new programming model. I would, by the way, argue that virtually any framework that you learn is a new programming model anyway. So I think it's pretty much a zero-sum game in that particular context. But anyway, And in both iOS and Android, you have to deal with large class libraries. And for some reason, Java developers, and came from a Java background, seem to be apprehensive about Objective-C, particularly those damn square brackets. What's up with that, right? And it's okay. Be not afraid. It's all right. So anyway, we'll talk about that in a moment. But device fragmentation tends to be an issue, especially for Android. I mean, I don't want to knock Android, but there are 10,001 different Android devices, and there are basically about 10 iOS devices, and fewer if you discount the ones that have been supposedly end-of-lifed, but device fragmentation is an issue because the CPUs and the GPUs in the devices affect your overall performance experience and your ability to deliver a particular class of applications. So you just need to be aware of that, and you have to pick your platform, your stack carefully. Okay. So some features about Objective-C and Xcode. I told you I was going to focus primarily on iOS as an example. Once again, I think Android in general, if you're comfortable with Java, Android development is not too bad. But I hear a lot of objections about Objective-C and whatnot, and especially things like it has no garbage collection. Especially on iOS. There used to be Objective-C on native Mac did have garbage collection, but they actually decided to deprecate that because Objective-C now has automatic reference counting, and it's just as good as garbage collection. And so great, you have to deal with pointers in your code, but it's just a freaking star in front of a variable. It's not that bad. Don't worry about it. It's okay. The message-oriented aspects of Objective-C, as I said before, tend to kind of throw people for a ride, right? And it's not, once again, it's just a different syntax. It's different from dot notation. But ultimately, you're basically saying, you know what? I'm going to send a message to this guy, and I'm going to tell this guy, this array, to insert an object, and that's the object, right, into a certain location within the array. Is it really that bad? No. Oh, I have to do more typing. Oh, it's so verbose. I'm sorry. I have zero sympathy for that. I don't really. I'm not saying it to be mean, but if I can learn it, if I can do it, and honestly, I'm a BD guy. I'm not an engineer anymore, okay? In fact, I should, I just don't do this anymore. If I can do it, you can do it. I mean, it's not that bad. But I would say that Objective-C, particularly Cocoa, the Cocoa framework, gives you something that's really neat called KVO, or Key Value Observing. And that helps you build really responsive user interfaces because it automatically binds your backend. And I say backend data model, but really what I mean your client-side data model, the internal data structures that represent the information that you're presenting in your UI, automatically binds them to the UI so that you can do round-trip changes of your data from the UI. I can type in a new value for a given whatever element in a table cell, for example, and that automatically gets reflected in the underlying data model. I don't have to write code that deals with what happens when you release the finger from a given cell and stores it into the model. It's just done for you. And so that's really, really cool. And the fact that I can also programmatically change the underlying data model, and because we have this data binding, this ability to observe that information, the UI can automatically reflect that information. It is so incredibly powerful. And it is not unique to Cocoa. Android and other UI frameworks give you this. But I want to make sure that I highlight it because it's something that you're going to use on a regular basis, regardless of what particular platform you're targeting. Asynchronous blocks are a relatively new feature, and I don't know if Java has something equivalent to this. Does it? Do you know? So basically, JavaScript does this a lot, where you can basically send or encapsulate anonymous functions that you send off to some method or something along those lines. They get executed and then return back. I think Java has something equivalent, but I haven't done Java development in a little while, so I got to double check that. But nonetheless, the asynchronous blocks are relatively new to the language, and they make development of asynchronous types of apps, which basically anything that deals with like user interactions and backend network operations and everything else are inherently asynchronous. So it makes that a lot easier, and it makes for more responsive apps. Because if you're waiting for something to happen in the backend, like a network operation, the fact that the UI can still do its thing, and then it will execute your code that might be responsible for updating an icon in the UI or something like that, it's a good thing. And also it has a great threading model, and it, more importantly, it has like a thread manager of sorts called Grand Central Dispatch. And the beauty of a Grand Central Dispatch, or GCD for short, is that it it helps prevent your application from misbehaving, especially on a CPU limited, memory limited device. The ability to say, you know what, I'm going to allow the operating system to decide, to queue up my operations, and that way it manages how many threads are active at any given point in time. And maybe on a particular piece of hardware and everything else, it can only allow 20 operations to happen simultaneously before it kind of starts slowing things down. Let the OS make those decisions for me, and GCD takes care of that for you. So that way you don't have to deal with your own queuing or thread pooling or anything along those lines. It's just done for you. So those are all great reasons for using, developing against Objective-C and iOS and so forth. And as I said, it's not that hard. This is roughly what I learned, how long it took me to learn this. And I would note that, first I learned the language, and that took me 3 or 4 days. But once I was reasonably comfortable with the language, collectively, it really took me 3 or 4 weeks total to start writing a non-trivial application. And I'll show you that application. Actually, I think I'm going to show it tomorrow. Yes, it's an HTML discussion, but I'm going to show one native application just because it also ties into an HTML5 app. But it's not, it's not that bad. Now, for cost reasons and other reasons, maybe we can't afford to give our engineers 4 to 6 weeks to learn a given platform or language. That's OK. I understand. I'm sensitive to that. So I wanted to give you guys a quick taste of the Alfresco iOS SDK, and so we'll take a look at just a few little snippets. I'm not going to actually go and launch the IDE or anything along those lines, but just as a reminder, you can go to github.com/alfresco and you can pick up the source code to the SDK there. It is open source, but more importantly, if you go to developer.alfresco.com/mobile, you can pick up the compiled versions, the official versions of the SDK, and play around. And there's lots of sample code. But really what it boils down to is that in order to, and you're going to, by the way, you're going to learn more about this if you attend the iOS and Android sessions later today. In fact, they're all consecutive and just in different rooms. But here we're setting up some initial variables, basically saying, OK, we're going to declare a string that's going to be a URL string, pointing to my Alfresco server. We have a string that's a username and password. And I have, I'm going to have a pointer to myself. This is actually very common in JavaScript. Have you ever had to do like self equals this type of stuff in JavaScript? Anyone? Yeah. Anyway, so you're going to have a reference to yourself, and then you're going to initialize a repository session, and you say, I want to connect to this URL with this username and password, and I'm going to pass along a completion block, which is, once again, it's a function, basically, that will execute on its own. And when it executes, it will be invoked with these parameters. So it's going to have this is just a generic pointer to an object, essentially, to the session that has been created, along with a pointer to a reference to the error, to any error that may have occurred. So what you need to do is check to see if you have a valid session. If you don't, then throw an error, handle it. Otherwise, you can basically say, OK, I authenticated, and here's some information that I've received from this particular session. So that's it. It's not that bad. I mean, yes, there's square brackets, but other than that, once again, not that bad. I will say this. By convention, not because of the language, an inherent flaw in the language, but by convention, Objective-C encourages you to be very, very verbose. So you do a little bit more typing. But I would argue that it makes the code generally more readable until, like, unless you're like coding at 2 in the morning or something like that, which I've done, and I'm just staring at this, and it's like I can't make sense of these letters and these words and stuff like that. So there are cases where maybe it's a little too verbose. So once you've created a session, I forgot to point out, by the way, I am going to reference the parent object and call the load root folder method. Okay, and so that's what I'm going to show you here. This is load root folder. And now we have an active session. It's been created and all that stuff. I do some initial, little work here. But I'm going to basically retrieve the folders, the children folders, hanging off of the root of my repository. And so basically, I execute the completion block just as before. And in this case, I will be passed an array along with an error message or an error object. And once again, I do some basic error checking to make sure that I received the array. And then I can do things like iterate through it or do whatever it is that I need to do. So here, for example, I'm just counting how many elements there are in the array. Here I'm accessing a property. So you see dot notation that is commonly used in Objective-C to access properties, not to access methods. And then I'm going to set on myself, there's a property called nodes, and I'm going to set its value to basically a new array using the original array as the source. And now I have an array set locally, and then I'm going to inform a table view in my UI to reload itself. And because of the magic of key value observing, the UI knows what to do. Given an array, a table view will generate the necessary information. So anyway, so that's it there. I want to double check my time. So far, so good. OK, so another use case would be, or I'm going to go use conference applications as an example of the different classes of apps. And so let's start with a native app. No, the Salesforce one is not a native app, but this one here. So so this is the WWDC app. And it is 100% native, right? And UI snobs love to like scroll things as a way of testing how good the app is for some reason. I can't say I'm a big UI snob, but I must have hung around with them for a while because the first thing I want to do is just see how quick it takes to load the data, and then how well does it scroll around, right? And when I do things like tap on items out, how quickly does it load up additional views and whatnot? I think that's a little extreme, but the point is that we generally don't want user interfaces that lag too much as I'm swiping or performing my actions. If I go and look at lists of things, how quickly does it respond? And is there good, the rubber banding effect? We've become accustomed to these things. Those of us that own iOS devices, we've become accustomed to these things that we sometimes expect these of our enterprise apps. So making sure that it generally responds well, I think, is important. The other part is, especially if we're dealing with multimedia, and this is where HTML5 types of apps and hybrid apps can sometimes fall apart, is how well does it handle things like pinch zoom and scrolling of long lists that contain things like multimedia. Generally, this is fairly smooth. I won't say that this is the epitome of native apps. It is not, but it's a pretty decent example of what would happen if you develop a native app and stick to some basic rules, and the experience tends to be pretty decent. Okay. So, returning to the presentation. Oops. What happened here? Apologies. There we go. So now let's talk about HTML5, the opposite side of the spectrum. And there's a whole session on this, so I'm going to keep it fairly brief. But why would you want to do HTML5? First and foremost, it's easier to distribute. You just share a URL. That's it. It's not bad. Plus, iOS and Android and others give you the ability to save an HTML5 app into your home screen, so it kind of looks like a real app. It's not bad. And because most smartphones use WebKit as their core browsing engine, right? Their rendering engine. Generally speaking, you're just targeting one platform. If it works with WebKit, for the most part, it will work on other devices, on many devices. There's some caveats. Depending on the version of Android, this is particularly true of Android, but less so of iOS, because Apple controls the hardware. They control the hardware, what can I say? But some manufacturers may not necessarily do things like support hardware acceleration within the browsers and the devices. So hardware acceleration is particularly important for animations, rendering shadows, and a bunch of other things. And so you got to make sure that your UI is fairly simple. But for the most part, it's pretty darn good. It's something that I am actually very interested in it. That's why I'm talking about HTML5 later. You can leverage your existing development skills. If you know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you can be very productive and create good, solid apps with this. I already talked about easy distribution. And it's very well suited for mostly text-oriented, content-oriented websites, as long as you keep the interactions fairly simple, okay? And relatively few screens. The bigger your HTML5 app, the less practical it might be to have target native devices. There are some caveats, though. You cannot distribute it through app stores and marketplaces and stuff like that. You have limited data persistence, so for performance reasons, it makes sense to be able to cache data locally, doesn't it? And while HTML5 does define a spec for doing this, it is inconsistently implemented in the different environments, in the different runtimes. So we need to be aware of this. Touch, it's a touchy subject when it comes to HTML5. HTML5 supports the touch event, which is it's almost handled like a click. And the problem with it is that it is not it's too low level. It does not HTML5 does not make provisions for dealing with gestures. So a pinch, you have to implement the code yourself, and it is not easy because for every touch event, you have to basically you have to track each of the touches independently and be able to then perform all the mathematical matrix operations to figure out whether you're actually the fingers are being spread apart or they're being brought together. And what if the moment you start tracking more than one finger at a time, and on an iOS you can track like I think 11 fingers. No, 10 I think it's the max, but it might be 11 actually. Anyway, but no. So the more fingers you're tracking, the harder it is to compute and whatnot. So keep your gestures fairly simple is what I would say there, because it lacks gesture recognizers. Cocoa Touch does have gesture recognition, so it can recognize swipes and pinches and whatever. Performance can be an issue. The more stuff you're doing within your HTML5 app, you're ultimately manipulating a browser DOM, and you could start eating into both your CPU and memory, and that could be an issue. And as I said, inconsistent use of hardware acceleration could deal a death knell to your app, particularly things like box shadow, CSS box shadow. On some older devices nowadays, it kills it. I would have to say that I want to give credit to Google for their Project Butter, which is part of Jelly Bean, which actually they made significant, incredible strides in terms of overall performance and so forth. And I have to also mention that despite its promise, just like Java, it's not always write once, run anywhere. I'm sorry. If the app is simple, it will run virtually anywhere. But the more fancy, the fancier you get, or if you're targeting multiple devices with different screen proportions and stuff like that, things get a little bit more complicated. So do make sure that you account for that. And I would argue that, or I would suggest that you just focus on a small subset of things, and then over time you can expand to support more platforms. Okay. So to make it work, and in a sense I jumped ahead a little bit, but pick your target platforms, keep that list short, use adaptive responsive design, and emphasize touch within your app. So big buttons, don't use hyperlinks. I don't know about you guys, but every time I see like an HTML5 based app and there's a little hyperlink buried in a bunch of text, or if there are a bunch of hyperlinks all close together, that's worse, right? I miss all the time, right? And it's like, oh crap, I didn't want to hit that. So anyway. So limit that. So let's look at Dreamforce, and we're going to look at their mobile app. Yes, sir?
I think earlier in the presentation you were talking about HTML5, you talked about geolocation services.
Yeah, GPS is available to HTML5, and what will happen is that if you have an HTML5 app that requests access to the GPS, the user will be prompted. You hit yes, and those coordinates are going to be, the latitude and longitude will be made available to the app and therefore to any other backend service that supports that. So, okay. So Dreamforce. So here's the Dreamforce app, and this is an HTML5 app, as you'll see in a moment. And it's not too bad. I mean, as you would expect, you can do things like look at agendas. But notice what's happening. We're loading a new page. We wait. This little spinner, at least it's a good thing. Put up a spinner. You're loading your content, and here's my content. But notice there's a little bit of lag when I scroll. I think that's okay. For this type of app, it's okay. But expanding some of these elements doesn't really animate very well. There's a little bit of lag and whatnot, but generally it's not too bad. What happens if I close this? We get good animation. The swipe animation is a good thing, so that's hardware accelerated. And notice that it uses shadows in this case, so it's leveraging the hardware acceleration that's available here. I would also make note, by the way, before I forget, that at least as far as iOS is concerned, Safari, yeah, like an app, a JavaScript CSS app that's running on Safari generally performs faster than one that's running inside a web view. And the reason for this is that the JavaScript runtime, the Nitro engine, is not fully available to apps that are not running inside the Safari web browser. And so just kind of keep that in mind. So anyway, so here's a big long list of things, and I'm swiping and whatnot. Once again, I think this is not a valid test necessarily, but at least it gives us an idea of what the user experience is. And apparently, I swiped all the way up and pulled to refresh, and so there was a little bit of a lag while it refreshed the data. I would just as soon have done this asynchronously, kind of trigger a background operation and whatnot. But that's it. So let's see what happens if I animate this little thing down. It's not bad. So good enough. It gives us an idea. This is a good app, I think. Okay, but there are some caveats. Okay, turn that off and return to my presentation. So now let's talk about hybrid. So why hybrid? Well, you can still leverage your existing skills. Most hybrid frameworks and platforms are generally encourage you to use JavaScript and HTML. You can distribute your apps through marketplaces. You have, in some cases, in fact, almost all cases, you have native UI element access to a degree, depending on the specific framework that you're using. And almost all of them, as far as I'm aware, give you native device access, and that's actually a great thing, particularly camera, storage, database, that kind of stuff. So there are, I've personally identified two primary models for hybrid frameworks, and they all give you some kind of MVC style, framework to work on. But the two flavors are JavaScript at the core and then more web-oriented cores. And what I mean by this, and by the way, the canonical example of JavaScript cores is Accelerator's Titanium. It's a very good product, but what it encourages you to do is develop your controller logic in JavaScript. But this JavaScript ultimately drives a native UI. And that's a good thing because you get native UI widgets. You do not get it's not a web browser that you're controlling, and that's a good thing. So what they've basically done is that they took the WebKit's JavaScript runtime, and they recompiled the open source version. They recompiled it and they run it in their own little container, and that's what is basically driving the UI, driving the UI for you. So basically, your UI is native, JavaScript at the core, and then anything related to your models is usually native. By this, what I mean is that you have access to things like the SQLite database and local file system access and all those types of things. The ones that are web core, and the examples here are definitely PhoneGap is probably the most popular toolkit for this, but RowMobile and there's a tool called Trigger.io that is pretty neat. It's a startup, but they're doing some really neat stuff. Generally speaking, your controller logic is also in JavaScript. However, they tend to espouse your UI, your front end, to be basically HTML and CSS, with all that comes with it, both the pros and the cons. What this means then is that you do, as a web developer, you might have a lot more control over the UI and everything else, but you do not necessarily get things like native table views, native buttons, or anything along those lines. They're always going to be ultimately HTML, and that has its pros and cons. But they do give you access to some native elements. For example, from PhoneGap, I can invoke the camera, and you can create native plugins. So for example, there's a barcode scanner, a QR code scanner that's available for PhoneGap, and so I can invoke that and scan barcodes and all that stuff. So anyway, so that's those are the two primary flavors. There's some caveats associated with this. So non-trivial apps are still hard to develop. Just like many hybrid frameworks, I mean, hybrid anything, sometimes it's not, it's a situation of jack of all trades, master of none, right? And sometimes you still need to you still have compromises. And I know that Nathan was developing an Accelerator app, and he had his nightmares. And are you a hater?
No.
No.
The issue you mentioned about fragmentation in Android making it difficult.
Yeah.
Throw iOS devices into the mix,
Yeah.
it becomes even more difficult.
Yep, and this is with an Accelerator hybrid app, right? Yeah, so even with hybrid, it does not solve your cross-platform woes. And because things like PhoneGap still use web views, you can still get jank. and jank is just when there's a lot of kind of skipping and stopping and stuff like that as you're doing things like scrolling. So now let's look at the same Dreamforce app, but this time it's their hybrid app. All right, so there it is. So, well, that's already a problem, I think, but it's a splash screen. Come on, anytime now. Well, I'm going to go ahead and quit it. Dreamforce. So this is a good example of the PhoneGap style approach, which is web views. The UI is 100% identical, right? Why? Because it's basically, it is the same code. So all the interactions and everything else that we saw before, it's happening here as well. At the end of the day, we're still dealing with a web browser. The main difference is that this does have some native device access. For example, I can access the camera. So if I hit this little button here, I have the camera, so I can scan QR codes, right? I have one on my badge somewhere, but you get the idea, right? And so that is a benefit. But another benefit is the fact that the Salesforce guys wrote only one app, basically, right? And then they tweaked it to native. So there's a benefit to this. You can deliver it via the browser, and you can now deliver it to the App Store, and you can access the camera here. So that I think is very encouraging. Another hybrid app, it would be the Accelerator style, and this would be the CodeStrong app. So Accelerator had their conference not too long ago, and so what we're seeing here really is a collection of native views and smooth scrolling. Yet each of those views include some HTML. So think of each of these; it's usually a little mini web browser, okay? But because we're wrapping inside a native table view and stuff like that, and list view, it's generally pretty performant, okay? So not too shabby. All right, so that's those are the two flavors of apps. Oops, I should have turned off mirroring. And return here. All right, so let's summarize. Nice little table that more or less highlights the relative pros and cons of the different approaches. I think we saw that in general, native gives you high performance, device access, and ultimately, if you've got the skills, the mad hacker skills, it gives you a lot of flexibility. But there are some cons, particularly the learning curve. It's still an effort, and obviously, it's not cross-device, cross-platform. HTML5 gives you fast development of your apps and cross-browser support. However, you may have limited device access. There are HTML5 APIs now for things like cameras, but they're not necessarily implemented on iOS, for example. But I think what we're going to start seeing over time is more parity. And I'm actually bullish on HTML5 as a platform. And there's a great article by Mozilla basically dispelling a lot of the myths around HTML5-based mobile app development. And I strongly recommend that you read it, and I'll try to pull up the link a little bit later. However, you still have limited gesture support. You can only do basic touch event handling. Otherwise, you need to find a really good gesture recognition library, and those are hard to find. I have not found a really, really good one. Sencha Touch does give you some basic control over swipes and whatnot, but it's still relatively limited in capabilities. Hybrid gives you near native performance, depending on the framework, the specific tool set that you're using. Ultimately, your development is mostly JavaScript with some HTML potentially. You can distribute through the App Store, and you have improved device access. The learning curve is still there. Anytime you learn a new framework or whatever, learning curve, we talked about this. It's not always true cross-platform, as Nathan mentioned. And you also have some of the limitations around gestures that HTML5 also possess. Because at the end of the day, especially in the PhoneGap model, you're still dealing with a web browser, a web view. So to round up some of the tools that I've mentioned today, Accelerator, Apache Cordova, or PhoneGap, RoadMobile, Trigger.io. There's a lot of great JavaScript frameworks. Sprout Core, Ember.js, Neo.js is something that's coming out of the HP WebOS group. They're actually spinning off a separate company called Gram. And they're going to be commercializing a lot of the WebOS stuff. jQuery, jQuery Mobile, Sencha Touch, they're all great ways to get started. Because I run the technology partnership program, I encourage you guys, if you're developing apps for to use either internally or elsewhere, join the program. Go to developer.alfresco.com, build an app, and then fill out an application. So some parting thoughts. I think UX matters, user experience matters. Native is not as complex as I think it seems, or many people think it seems. And despite any of my opinions, anything that I've expressed here, right, they're all opinions at the end of the day. Ultimately, you got to make the choice that's right for you. After all, you have to be realistic about these types of things. So I do recommend that you attend these sessions that are following up. Ballroom 5 and 6 is the next session at 3:50, and I don't know why I said 2:40. Are these times right? I think I messed them up. Doesn't matter. The next session is in Ballroom 5 and 6, and it's the iOS SDK introduction for those of you that want to learn more about that. And the same room, Alfresco Android SDK follows. And then tomorrow at 2:40 for sure, in the Blossom Hill room, I'll be talking about HTML5. Don't forget to rate this session. And you should be able to download the slides there. Hopefully they're up by now. And that's it. Thank you very much, guys.